The highway was a long, jagged scar across the desert's throat, and I was driving right down the middle of it. 12 hours behind the wheel had turned the world into a blur of gray asphalt and white lines that danced like ghosts in my headlights. Liam, that's me, was just trying to reach the coast before my eyes finally gave up and closed for good. The air in the car was stale, smelling of cold coffee and the desperate need for a real bed. I saw him standing there, a silhouette carved out of the midnight darkness by my high beams. He didn't wave or shout. He just stood with his thumb out, a statue of a man in the middle of nowhere. My first instinct was to floor it and leave him to the scorpions and the sand. My father's warnings about desert predators echoed in my mind, sharp and clear. But the road was so empty, and the silence in my car was becoming a heavy, suffocating weight. I slowed down, the gravel crunching under my tires like breaking bone as I pulled onto the shoulder. Vance, as he later called himself, jogged up to the door with a desperate energy that made the hair on my neck stand up. He was wearing a ragged denim jacket that had seen better decades and smelled of wood smoke and old sweat. He clutched a backpack to his chest as if it contained his very soul. He didn't wait for an invite. He just climbed inside. "Thanks for stopping, man," Vance muttered, his voice sounding like sandpaper on dry wood. I nodded, shifting the car back into gear and merging onto the black ribbon of the road. I asked him where he was headed, but he didn't answer right away. He just stared out the side window, his eyes darting across the dark landscape, as if he expected something to jump out of the shadows at any second. The tension in the car was immediate and very sharp. We drove in silence for miles, the only sound being the rhythmic hum of the tires and the occasional whistle of the wind through the door seals. Vance kept adjusting his grip on the backpack, his knuckles white and trembling. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, noting the way he flinched at every passing shadow. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a man who was being hunted by something much larger and hungrier than himself. "You see them?" Vance suddenly asked, his voice barely a whisper above the engine's low growl. I asked him what he meant, but he just pointed toward the rear-view mirror. Behind us there was nothing but the vast, empty darkness of the desert. I told him the road was clear, but he shook his head violently. He claimed that the lights weren't on the road, but behind the stars. I started to wonder if I had picked up a madman in a denim jacket. The atmosphere grew colder, a chill that had nothing to do with the car's air conditioning. Vance began to hum a low, discordant tune that felt like it was vibrating in the very marrow of my bones. Every time I glanced at him, his face seemed more gaunt, his skin pulling tight over his cheekbones like wet parchment. He told me that we needed to find a gas station, not for fuel, but for the light. He said the dark was starting to get hungry again. I saw the neon glow of a station on the horizon, a flickering island of artificial light in the sea of shadows. Vance leaned forward, his breath fogging up the windshield. He didn't look relieved. He looked terrified, as if the station was a trap rather than a sanctuary. I pulled up to the pumps, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of angry insects. Vance gripped the door handle but didn't open it. He just stared at the clerk inside. The clerk was a thin man with skin the color of ash, standing perfectly still behind the bulletproof glass. He wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, just staring out at the pumps with hollow, empty eyes. Vance turned to me, his face pale and sweating. He told me we couldn't stay here, that the light was wrong. I looked back at the clerk and realized he didn't have a shadow on the wall behind him. My foot found the accelerator before I could even think. We roared back onto the highway, leaving the buzzing lights and the shadowless man behind us. Vance was hyperventilating now, his hands clawing at the denim of his jacket. He started talking about the vessels, people who had been emptied out to make room for the things that lived in the desert's cracks. He said he had been running for 3 days, but his scent was already all over the air. I didn't want to believe him, but I couldn't forget the clerk. The road ahead felt different now, as if the asphalt itself had become a living thing that was slowly swallowing us whole. Vance sat huddled in the passenger seat, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps that filled the small cabin with a sense of impending doom. I kept my hands clamped on the steering wheel, my knuckles aching from the pressure. Every time I looked in the mirror, I expected to see those shadowless eyes staring back from the darkness of the desert. "They don't use cars, not really," Vance whispered, his voice cracking as he stared at the empty horizon. I asked him who he was talking about, but he just pointed to the static on the radio. A low, rhythmic pulsing began to bleed through the speakers, a sound that felt like a heartbeat made of broken glass. It didn't sound like any broadcast I had ever heard. It sounded like something ancient trying to remember how to speak through a machine. I tried to turn the radio off, but the knob just spun uselessly in my fingers. The pulsing grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards and into the soles of my feet. Vance began to rock back and forth, his backpack held tight against his chest. He told me that once you hear the frequency, you become part of the map. He said the desert wasn't just sand and rock. It was a hungry consciousness that used the highways to filter out the weak. Suddenly, the engine began to sputter and cough, the car losing momentum as if an invisible hand was pulling us backward. I floored the gas, but the needle on the speedometer continued to drop toward 0. The headlights flickered and dimmed, casting long, distorted shadows of the cacti across the road. Vance looked at me with pure terror in his eyes and told me that we were entering a dead zone, where the laws of physics started to fray. The car finally groaned to a halt in the middle of the dark highway. Silence crashed down on us, heavy and absolute. I turned the key, but the ignition stayed dead, not even a click answering my plea. Outside, the desert was perfectly still, the stars above looking like cold, uncaring eyes. Vance reached for his door handle, but stopped. He whispered that something was standing right outside my window, even though I could see nothing but the night. I looked through the glass, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. There was nothing there, just the vast emptiness of the sand. But then I saw a smudge of darkness that was slightly blacker than the rest. It moved with a slow, fluid grace that didn't belong to any animal. It wasn't a person. It was a shape that seemed to be missing a dimension. It drifted closer, and I felt a wave of nausea that made my head spin wildly. "Don't look at it directly," Vance hissed, pulling his hoodie over his eyes. He said that looking at the collectors was like inviting them to occupy the empty spaces in your mind. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for the engine to spark back to life. I could hear a soft, scratching sound against the driver's side door, like dry fingernails on metal. It circled the car, moving with a heavy, deliberate rhythm that felt like a countdown. A sudden spark of blue light erupted from the dashboard, and the engine roared to life with a violent scream. I didn't wait for Vance to say a word. I shifted into gear and slammed the pedal to the floor. The car fishtailed on the sand, tires screaming as they found purchase on the asphalt once more. I didn't look back, but I felt a cold draft on the back of my neck, as if the door had been opened and closed in the blink of an eye. We drove at breakneck speeds, the wind howling around the car like a chorus of the damned. Vance was silent now, but he was no longer trembling. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the road ahead with a vacant, glassy stare. I called his name, but he didn't respond. He just sat there, his hands finally resting loosely on his lap. The backpack he had been guarding so fiercely was now lying on the floorboards, forgotten and half open. I glanced down at the bag and saw a glimpse of what was inside. It wasn't money or documents. It was a collection of old, rusted keys and jars filled with gray dust. Underneath them lay a photograph of a house that looked exactly like the one I grew up in. My blood turned to ice as I realized that Vance hadn't been a random hitchhiker. He was a lure, and I had been driving him exactly where he needed to go all along. The desert sun had no mercy, but the night was even more cruel. Caleb gripped the wheel of his old sedan, his eyes straining against the darkness of a forgotten back road in Nevada. Beside him sat Josh, who was busy checking a camera lens, his face lit by the pale glow of a smartphone. They weren't looking for ghosts. They were looking for content. Caleb had this brilliant idea to film a fake breakdown prank to see how many people would actually stop to help a girl in distress. Mia was already in position, standing 2 miles ahead near an old, rusted bridge that looked like it hadn't seen a car in decades. She was wearing a tattered yellow dress, her long black hair covering her face to add to the eerie aesthetic Caleb wanted for the video. The plan was simple. Mia would pretend to be a stranded hitchhiker. Caleb and Josh would hide in the bushes with a night vision camera, and they'd capture the terrified reactions of helpful strangers. "She looks perfect," Josh whispered, zooming in on the small, flickering screen as they approached the site. Mia stood perfectly still under the moonlight, a pale ghost against the backdrop of the jagged canyon walls. She didn't look like an actress. She looked like a warning. Caleb felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt in his chest, but he pushed it down. Fame on the internet required risks, and he was sure Mia was safe as long as they were watching from the shadows. They parked the car out of sight and crawled into a thicket of dry brush. The silence of the desert was heavy, broken only by the occasional scuttle of a lizard. Mia remained at the edge of the road, her hands folded neatly in front of her. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Just as Josh was about to complain about the lack of traffic, a pair of dim, flickering headlights appeared on the horizon. A heavy, dark van was crawling toward the bridge at a snail's pace. The van stopped a few yards away from Mia, its engine idling with a low, rhythmic thumping that sounded like a labored breath. Caleb held his breath, his finger hovering over the record button. The driver's side door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a heavy canvas coat that seemed too warm for the desert night. He didn't approach Mia immediately. He just stood there, staring at her through the darkness with an intensity that felt violent. "Something's wrong," Josh muttered, his voice trembling slightly. The man began to walk toward Mia, but he wasn't asking if she needed help. He was carrying a heavy coil of rope and a small metallic object that glinted in the moonlight. Mia didn't move. She didn't scream or run toward their hiding spot as they had practiced. She just stood there, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching the man approach. Caleb realized with horror that she wasn't following the script. Caleb decided to intervene, but before he could stand up, the man stopped. He dropped the rope and fell to his knees, burying his face in his hands. He started to sob, a loud, guttural sound that echoed off the canyon walls like a wounded animal. Mia finally moved, but not away from him. She stepped closer and placed a pale hand on his shoulder. Her voice, thin and melodic, drifted through the air. "You're late," she whispered. "The others are already waiting inside." The man looked up, and even from the bushes, Caleb could see the raw terror on his face. He wasn't the predator. He was the prey. He scrambled back toward his van, but the vehicle wouldn't start. The engine coughed once and died, leaving the road in absolute darkness. From the shadows beneath the bridge, dozens of small, pale figures began to emerge. They all wore the same yellow dresses, and their hair covered their faces in identical silken curtains. Josh dropped the camera, the plastic casing cracking against a rock. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. All the figures in yellow turned their heads toward the bushes in perfect synchronization. Mia pointed a long, thin finger at their hiding spot. Caleb didn't wait to see more. He grabbed Josh by the collar and sprinted toward their car, his heart hammering against his ribs. Behind them, he could hear the sound of dozens of bare feet hitting the asphalt. They reached the sedan and peeled away, the tires throwing gravel in every direction. Caleb looked in the rearview mirror and saw Mia standing in the middle of the road, the man from the van now standing beside her, his expression vacant and glassy. They weren't chasing the car, they were just watching. Caleb realized then that the prank hadn't gone wrong. It had been hijacked by something that had been waiting for a reason to reveal itself on that bridge. The desert night seemed to stretch into eternity as I stared at the photograph in the backpack. It was my house, the small blue one on the edge of town, but in the picture, the windows were boarded up with heavy black planks. Vance, or whatever was left of him, sat beside me with that same hollow stare. I realized the jars of dust weren't just sand. They were labeled with names of people who had gone missing over the last decade. My name was on the largest jar, written in fresh, wet ink. I slammed on the brakes, but the car didn't stop. It felt like the steering column had disconnected, and the vehicle was being pulled by an invisible chain toward the jagged horizon. Vance finally turned his head, his neck popping with a sound like dry twigs snapping. He didn't have eyes anymore, just two pits of swirling gray smoke. He told me that the bait on the bridge had done its job, and the hunger of the desert was finally ready to be fed. My heart felt like it was going to explode. Up ahead, the old rusted bridge from Caleb's story appeared out of the fog, but it looked different, larger, more organic, like it was made of bone rather than iron. I saw Caleb's sedan abandoned on the side of the road, its doors wide open and interior lights flickering like a dying pulse. There was no sign of Caleb or Josh, only a trail of yellow fabric leading down into the dark gorge below. The pulsing radio frequency returned, now so loud it made my ears bleed. Vance reached out a cold, clammy hand and gripped my wrist. He didn't speak with his mouth, but his voice echoed inside my skull, cold and metallic. He explained that they needed vessels to carry the dust back to the cities, to spread the silence of the desert to the world of the living. I was chosen not because I stopped, but because I had the specific kind of guilt they could exploit. Every mile I drove was a mile deeper into a trap I had built for myself long ago. I fought against his grip, but it was like trying to break free from a mountain. The car rolled onto the bridge, and the engine finally died for good. The air outside was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient dust. I looked out the window and saw them hundreds of figures in yellow dresses standing on the railings, watching us with tilted heads. Among them stood Mia, her black hair flowing in a wind that didn't exist. She looked at me and smiled, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "The prank is over, Liam," she said, her voice sounding like 1,000 whispering insects. I realized then that Caleb and Josh were already gone, their voices added to the discordant hum of the radio. They hadn't escaped. They were the new guardians of the bridge. Vance began to dissolve into gray smoke, his denim jacket falling onto the seat like a hollow shell. The backpack spilled its contents, and the rusted keys began to glow with a sickly, pale green light. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, as if someone was pouring cold ash into my veins. My vision began to blur, the world turning into a series of flat, animated shapes. I was losing my grip on reality, becoming just another character in their twisted script. I reached for the door handle, desperate to jump into the gorge, but the car was locked from the outside. The figures in yellow began to tap on the glass, their movements synchronized and rhythmic. One by one, the windows began to crack under the pressure of their pale fingers. Mia leaned against the windshield, her face pressing against the glass until it shattered into a million sparkling diamonds. She reached inside and touched my forehead with a finger that felt like a needle of ice. She told me that the road only goes one way now, and there are no more exits. The gray smoke from Vance's remains began to swirl around me, filling my lungs and choking my screams. In the distance, I saw the headlights of another car approaching the bridge. A new traveler, tired and lost, looking for a way home. I tried to wave them away, to warn them of the trap, but my arms wouldn't move. I felt my skin turning pale and my hair growing long and dark. I looked down at my clothes and saw the blue hoodie melting away, replaced by a tattered yellow dress. I wasn't the driver anymore. I was the bait, waiting for the next hero to stop. The new car slowed down, the gravel crunching under its tires. I stood on the shoulder of the road, my thumb out, my face hidden behind a curtain of black hair. The driver, a young woman with a kind face, pulled over and opened the door. "Do you need a ride?" she asked, her voice full of a sympathy that made me want to weep. I climbed inside, clutching my backpack of dust, and whispered the only word I had left: "Thanks." The cycle had begun again. The young woman, whose name was Clara, didn't notice the way my hands trembled as I buckled the seatbelt. She was talking about her long drive and how glad she was to have some company. I looked at her, seeing the life and warmth in her eyes, and felt a wave of nausea. I wanted to scream, to tell her to jump out of the car while she still could, but my tongue felt like a piece of dry wood. The gray dust in my backpack began to hum, vibrating against my ribs with a cold, rhythmic pulse. As we drove, the road behind us began to dissolve into the same thick, unnatural fog that had swallowed Liam and Vance. Clara didn't look in the rearview mirror. She was too focused on the dark asphalt ahead. I noticed that the radio was playing that same discordant frequency, but to her, it probably sounded like ordinary static. She reached out to adjust the dial, and for a second, our hands brushed. Her skin felt like a furnace compared to the icy void that I had become. We passed the rusted bridge again, but this time I saw Caleb and Josh. They weren't in the bushes anymore. They were standing on the road, wearing heavy canvas coats and holding coils of rope. Their faces were blank, their eyes replaced by the same smoky pits I had seen in Vance. They didn't try to stop us. They just tipped their heads in a silent salute as we passed. Clara waved back, thinking they were just road workers. She had no idea she was looking at her future. "It's a beautiful night, isn't it?" Clara asked, her voice sounding like a distant memory. I managed to nod, my neck cracking with that sickening sound of dry twigs. I looked down at my lap and saw that my hands were becoming translucent, the bones beneath the skin glowing with a faint green light. The backpack was breathing now, the fabric rising and falling in sync with the desert's hidden heart. We were approaching the next gas station, the one where the shadowless clerk was waiting. The station appeared on the horizon, its neon lights flickering like a dying star. Clara pulled in, saying she needed to stretch her legs. I watched her walk toward the bulletproof glass, her shadow stretching long and vibrant across the concrete. The clerk looked up, and for a brief moment, I saw a flash of pity in his hollow eyes. He knew. He had seen this cycle repeat 1,000 times. He handed Clara a small silver key with strange engravings, telling her it was a gift for the guest. Clara came back to the car, smiling as she showed me the key. The guy inside was a bit weird, but look at this, she said, tossing the key into the cup holder. As soon as the metal touched the plastic, the car's interior was flooded with a blinding red light. The doors locked with a thunderous bang and the engine roared to life, without Clara even touching the ignition. The GPS screen flickered to life, displaying a map of a city that didn't exist on any human atlas. I felt the final stage of the transformation beginning. My memories of being Liam, of my blue hoodie and my house, were being erased, replaced by a cold, mechanical hunger. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was the collector's apprentice. I reached for the silver key, and as my fingers closed around it, the gray dust from the bag exploded, filling the cabin with a thick, suffocating cloud. Clara started to cough, her beautiful face contorting in terror as she finally realized the truth. "Liam?" she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I watched as her shadow began to detach itself from her body, sliding across the seat and disappearing into the floorboards. Her eyes turned glassy, and her hair began to grow at an impossible rate, turning dark and silken. I reached out and touched her forehead, just as Mia had touched mine. "The road only goes one way," I whispered, the words echoing with the weight of 1,000 lost souls. By the time we reached the edge of the desert, the car was empty except for 2 figures in yellow dresses. The sun began to rise, but it didn't bring any warmth. It was a cold, white disk that cast no shadows. We stood on the shoulder of a new highway, miles away from where we started. The network was expanding, weaving its web through the veins of the country, turning every shortcut and every wrong turn into a gateway for the gray dust to enter the world. I looked at the girl beside me, who used to be Clara. She stood perfectly still, her thumb out, waiting for the next car. I felt a strange sense of pride. We were the perfect bait, the ultimate prank, played by the desert on the curious and the kind. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the laughter of the grinning man, a sound that celebrated the end of the world as we knew it. The silence was no longer coming. It was already here, riding in the passenger seat. Years later, people would tell stories about the yellow girls of the interstate, the hitchhikers who never spoke and always left behind a jar of dust. They became an urban legend, a warning whispered by truckers and travelers. But the warnings never worked. Guilt and curiosity are stronger than fear, and as long as there are lonely roads and tired drivers, there will always be someone willing to stop. Every act of kindness was just another brick in the prison we were building. The final shot of the morning revealed a highway littered with silver keys and abandoned cars. A new sedan approached the spot where we stood. I felt a familiar pull, the mechanical instinct to reach out. I extended my thumb, my face hidden behind the black curtain of hair. The car slowed down, the gravel popping under its tires. The door opened, and a man looked out. "Need a lift?" he asked. I smiled, showing my jagged teeth. "Always," I replied. The loop was closed.